Good afternoon. The subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing will the record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record subject to length limitations in the rules. As a reminder, I'd like to remind the audience members that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law and will not be tolerated. Although wearing themed shirts while seated in the hearing room is permissible, holding up signs during the meeting proceedings is not. Any disruptions will result in the suspension of the proceedings until the Capitol Police can restore order. And we thank you for following those. Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for joining us today to discuss this sobering topic. The latest outbreak of ethnic violence in Burma's Rakhine state has brought about the most urgent humanitarian emergency in the Asia-Pacific today. We are convening this hearing today for 2 primary purposes. First, to gather information and impressions from our expert panel, some of whom have recently been on the ground in Burma to see this firsthand, and secondly, to hear their recommendations for how the U.S. policy can best address this crisis. The Rohingya, a stateless Muslim people living in the Rakhine state, are frequently described as the world's most persecuted minority, denied citizenship in Burma, and treated as unwanted illegal immigrants. Their modern history has been a continuous deprivation of basic human rights, punctuated with episodes of extreme violence. The latest of these is ongoing, and it's just unbelievable the amount of persecution that's going on. On August 25th, the Arcane Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA, a Rohingya militant group, launched a coordinated attack on a security outpost in Burma's Rakhine state, killing approximately a dozen personnel in the weeks that have followed. The Burmese military has carried out a brutal retaliatory crackdown against the Rohingya population as a whole, characterized by sickening crimes against humanity. Human Rights Watch released a report on Monday documenting widespread and systematic attacks on the Rohingya civilians, deportations, and forced population transfers, murders including the murder of women and children, sexual violence, the razing of villages, and the deployment of landmines along paths used by the refugees. The reporting is corroborated by eyewitness accounts on the ground and satellite images, and it is heart-wrenching in its details. The military's violence has sparked a massive refugee outflow into neighboring Bangladesh, which The Economist reports is the most intense since the Rwanda genocide. In this latest crisis alone, about 436,000 Rohingya have crossed the border, overwhelming the aid organizations there and bringing the total number of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh to near 1 million. An unknown number of additional Rohingya remain internally displaced within the Rakhine state. The death toll is in the hundreds at least, and that's at a minimum. But aid organizations and reporters are denied access to this affected area, and the total number may be much higher in the tens of thousands. The road ahead will be difficult. Responding to the immediate crisis will be an enormous task, to say nothing of a sustainable, lasting solution to the Rohingya dilemma. Burma has not created a space for the Rohingya in its society, and there is little appetite among the Buddhist majority to do so. State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, once thought as a global symbol of human rights and democracy, has led a lackluster response by the Burmese government, focusing on denial and blaming the victims. The ARSA militants are also not helping their fellow Rohingya. Their latest attack came on the very day a commission headed by the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan released his recommendations on easing ethnic tensions in Rakhine. This was the government's most high-profile effort to improve the conditions in Rakhine, following previous episodes of violence and ARSA attack against the ARSA attack just as Aung San Suu Kyi pledged to implement the panel's recommendations. Recent reports have indicated that the outflow of refugees to Bangladesh has slowed or stopped, which foreshadows the next stage of the crisis. The enormous challenge for humanitarian aid organizations to shift from life-saving measures to a longer-term effort to house and feed almost 1 million people who, under the current circumstances, are totally incapable of seeing to their own needs. In Washington, we will need to determine how we can best support these efforts, as well as what policy options are available for pressuring the Burmese military to stop its brutal violence and encouraging the civilian government to take a firmer stand against the military's atrocities. So I thank the witnesses for joining us today and look forward to their testimony and recommendations. Without objections, the written statements will be entered into the hearing, and I now turn to the ranking member for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm told that the ambassador from Bangladesh is here. Thank you, sir, for being here. But more importantly, thank you for what your country, one of the poorest countries in the world, is doing to take care of hundreds of thousands of refugees. I'd also like to introduce the ambassador of Burma, but unfortunately I can't because that ambassador is not here. If that ambassador were here, that ambassador could find out what the world thinks of the policy of the Burmese government toward hundreds of thousands of its own citizens. A humanitarian tragedy is unfolding in Burma, which is also referred to as Myanmar. Burma's military, the Tatmadaw, moved against the Rohingya population after an August 25th attack by Rohingya militants on Burmese security forces. And nearly 500,000 Rohingya Muslim refugees have fled their homeland in the Rakhine state following Burmese military operations against them. The UN High Commission for Human Rights noted that this situation seems to be a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Late last year, something similar occurred on a smaller scale when an estimated 60,000 to 90,000 Rohingyas fled to Bangladesh as a result of Burmese military operations that have followed an October 2016 Rohingya militant attack on border police. The vast majority of those who fled to Bangladesh, which is, as I pointed out, already impoverished and overcrowded, so the vast majority have fled there. Roughly 40,000 fled to India. Unfortunately, media reports indicate that India's border security forces are attempting to prevent Rohingya from entering India through Bangladesh amidst the ongoing exodus from Burma, including the reported use of stun guns and pepper grenades. However, I should point out that the international law is different for Bangladesh, which is the first resting place of those fleeing. Once the people are in Bangladesh, they're not being oppressed, although they are not economically viable at the present time. And so whether India has an obligation to accept them from Bangladesh is subject that perhaps our witnesses can get into. The United States has led an international response to protect we've led the international response to protect Muslims in Kosovo and in Bosnia against Serb aggression. We need to play a role, along with others, in protecting the Rohingya and dealing with the humanitarian needs. And we also need to make sure that the Muslim world realizes that we are the only country to bomb a Christian nation, Serbia, for the defense of Muslims, something that is not widely focused on in the Muslim world. The administration should work to ensure that the physical needs of hundreds of thousands of refugees are provided for, secure a halt to Burmese military operations against the Rohingya, secure a safe return of the Rohingya population back to Burma, demand that Burma end decades of discrimination against the Rohingya, including addressing cases of appropriated land, citizenship rights, political representation, a lack of free movement, and economic improvements. This is especially necessary is citizenship rights, the idea that a people could live in a country generation after generation and still be called foreigners under that country's laws is simply outrageous. We are to urge the United Nations Security Council to establish a UN Security Council probe a commission on Burmese ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya, and urge the United Nations Security Council to establish a UN-monitored safe zone for the Rohingya in Rakhine State to protect it from future mass killings. The Burmese government says it will allow the return of these refugees, catch-22, when they provide proof of nationality. But since 1982, the Burmese government has stripped the Rohingya of their citizenship, making it impossible for them to prove Burmese nationality. This is outrageous. Every group of people on the earth has immigrated to where they live from somewhere else, since we all came from apparently Eastern Africa. And to say that you are not a citizen of a country because you cannot prove that your most ancient ancestors were born there would make us all citizens perhaps of Ethiopia and no citizens of any other country in the world. It is that I say that just to show how absurd the position is, to deny citizenship for people not only born in a country but whose parents and even grandparents were born in that country. The United States was closely involved in bringing democracy to Burma, a process that included elections in 2010 and 2015, the release of political prisoners, the formation of a civilian government, and the lifting of UN sanctions. The United States should also take the lead in upholding democratic practices, and democracy goes with fair treatment of minorities and a protection of minorities. It must press the Burmese government to end military operations against the Rohingya, accept the refugees back, and grant them citizenship. I think they're already legally citizens, recognize that citizenship. In September of last year, I, along with other members of this subcommittee, met with Aung San Suu Kyi as the former administration decided to lift a number of economic sanctions on Burma. It's clear after the massacres and cleansing of October 2016 and the recent actions that we need to reevaluate that policy. Last week, the State Department announced the U.S. is providing an additional $32 million in humanitarian assistance. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses whether that's sufficient, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I too also would like to welcome Ambassador Ziauddin. Thank you for being here, for representing Bangladesh, and thank you for the support you have given to this crisis that's ongoing. And I would like to comment the ranking member on his pointing out that the United States is a nation that's the only nation that's bombed a Christian nation to protect a Muslim populace. With that, I'd like to turn to Mr. Shabbat from Ohio for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this really very important hearing at a critical time. The news, as you indicated, from the Rakhine State about the humanitarian crisis, unfortunately seems to be getting worse every day. As a former chairman of this committee, I've been following this with really great concern for some time now. The previous administration touted Burma as a success story and relaxed many of the restrictions that have been longstanding, including on the Burmese military. Unfortunately, we are seeing that in many ways the Burma that we see today isn't that much different than the one that we knew only a few years ago. There have been some improvements, but far too few. A number of us at the time we warned that this democratic transformation was incomplete, and that President Obama and then Secretary of State Clinton's optimism was premature. The current situation in Rakhine State, unfortunately, seems to illustrate that we were right, as much as I wish that we had been wrong. So I look very much forward to this very distinguished panel here and hearing what solutions, what we can do to help. So I thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Now we'll go to Mr. Rohrabacher for an opening statement.
I've been following events in this part of the world for a number of decades, and but I will have to admit that I have a very shallow information base, knowledge base on what is happening today, on the issue being described today. And I will be very interested in hearing a history of this. I realize that, and I've been very active in the past in trying to support the Karens and the Karennis who were brutalized by the Burmese government. And the Karens and the Karenni, of course, are Christians, or at least a large segment of their population is Christian. And I understand from the people I know in Burma that there is a great deal of brutality still going on by the Burmese government toward the Karens and the Karenni. However, being Christians, they don't seem to get as much attention as it is when we see a group of Muslims who are under attack. I think that it's up to us to send a message to Burma that this type of repression, both whether it's Christians or Muslim, that attacks on unarmed civilians is unacceptable. And but let me also note that we need to send a message to the people, to the Muslim people of the world, that our human rights agenda is not just a front to attack Muslim regimes when they are doing something wrong, but when Islamic people are being victimized, that we care about them just as we do anyone else. So I thank you for this hearing today. I plan to educate myself from what we're going to hear from the witnesses. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Rohrabacher. Now we'll go to Ms. Ann Wagner for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing. I, too, am devastated by the news coming out of Burma. For over 60 years, the Burmese government has persecuted religious and ethnic minorities across the country. War has raged in Karen State, Chin State, Shan State, Kachin State, and the list goes on and on. The Obama administration lifted sanctions, arguing that Burma was becoming a democracy. But Burma's government has no authority over the nation's powerful military. Human rights and democracy activists across Burma feel abandoned. The Christians in Kachin State have been ignored by the West, and the Rohingya Muslims have been left for dead, with more Rohingya now living outside of Burma than living inside of Burma. The international community must stop demanding action and take action. We are, in part, to blame for not holding the Burmese government and military accountable for their actions. So I want to thank you all very much for coming today, and a special thanks to Mr. Sullivan and to Ms. Gittleman for the advocacy work that you do in this arena, and my sincere thanks to the ambassador from Bangladesh for the generosity of your country in opening up your border. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. And this hearing today is so important, you know, the atrocities that are going on out there. And we depend on the information that you guys give us, the panel, on the direction we go. You know, and when we look into the history of this, the length of time this has been going on, I don't know how the world can stand by and do nothing. And so you guys are going to bring this out into the open. And I don't want to say you're not doing anything, because you're the ambassador. You are dealing with this in a good way, and we commend you. But we have to bring a stop to this. This is the 21st century, and we're doing stuff from the Stone Age to people on the ground. We met with an NGO yesterday, and he was showing us graphic pictures of charred bodies that were lined up, people with flamethrowers burning people in the 21st century. It's unacceptable, and we need to bring this to an end with the world community. And so with that, I look forward to your testimonies, and I want you to understand that so much of what you guys tell us in a hearing goes into legislation that we put on through the State Department, maybe the Treasury or other organizations. So be very specific, be bold. I give you the permission, and you can direct us. You know, use this opportunity to say, if I could write the legislation, this is what I would do to bring this to an end. So I welcome your testimonies. You're limited to about 5 minutes. Try to end when the red light goes on or ends at 5 minutes. Make sure you press your button so the microphone is on. And with that, I'm going to introduce the panel. And we're going to start with Dr. Michael Martin, Specialist in Asian Affairs for the Congressional Research Service, Foreign Affairs, Defense, and Trade Division. Thank you for being here. Mr. Walter Lohman, thank you for being back. Director of the Asian Studies Center for the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Daniel Sullivan, Senior Advocate for Human Rights at the Refugee International. And Ms. Andrea Gittleman, Program Manager for the Simon Skote Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. That's a mouthful. Thank you for being here. And Dr. Martin, if you don't mind, we'll start with you and look forward to hearing from you.
Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, and the members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the current crisis in Burma's Rakhine State, the status of the Rohingya who have fled to Bangladesh, as well as those remaining in Burma. The current crisis in Burma's Rakhine State is not the first time in which thousands of Rohingya have fled to Bangladesh, nor is it the only crisis in Burma that involves forced displacement of thousands of Burmans from their home. According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, there were over 375,000 internally displaced persons in Burma at the end of 2016, due to the nation's ongoing civil war. In addition, more than 100,000 refugees live in camps in Thailand as a result of past fighting in Karen, Karenni, Mon, and Shan states. Some of these refugees have been living in camps for over 30 years. While Burma's civil war and ongoing humanitarian challenges are issues in their own rights, it is the plight of the Rohingya that has captured the world's attention. Since Burma's military junta, the State Peace and Development Council, transferred power to a mixed civilian-military government in 2011, large-scale forced displacement of Rohingya have occurred on 4 occasions, from June to October 2012, again in the spring of 2015, during the winter of 2016-2017, and most recently starting on August 25th, 2017. The latest displacement began after the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, or ARSA, allegedly attacked 30 security outposts in northern Rakhine State. Burma's military, or Tatmadaw, responded by initiating a clearance operation in the townships of Butidong, Mongdaw, and Rathadong. As a result, over half of Burma's estimated 1.1 million Rohingya are now in refugee camps in Bangladesh, and I would add that that percentage is probably low. During my 2-week trip to Burma earlier this month, I visited 3 camps of internally displaced persons, or IDPs, in northern Shan State. I also interviewed 6 individuals who said they had been beaten by Tatmadaw soldiers for their alleged support of ethnic armed organizations, or EAOs, operating near their villages. Their stories of abuse at the hands of the Tatmadaw were amazingly similar, maybe not surprisingly similar, to those being told by the Rohingya right now in Bangladesh. I would also add that none of them accounted similar beatings by EAO soldiers. During my trip, I was repeatedly told that most Burmans, including other ethnic minorities, welcomed the Tatmadaw's clearance operation and the resulting displacement of the Rohingya. The popular narrative among Burmans is that the Rohingya are Bengalis, illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, and are part of an effort to transform Burma into a Muslim nation, as was done in Indonesia and Malaysia centuries ago. When asked, people discredit claims of misconduct by the Tatmadaw soldiers and attribute any human rights abuses to ARSA. While many international observers have criticized State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi for a failure to take action, few have directed their criticism at Burma's Commander-in-Chief, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. Under Burma's 2008 constitution written by the Tatmadaw, General Min Aung Hlaing has supreme authority over all of Burma's security forces, including the Tatmadaw, Border Guard forces, and the Myanmar Police Force. State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi and the civilian government have little direct authority over those security forces. The events of the past month in Burma raise a number of potential issues for Congress. Congress may consider the immediate humanitarian crisis in Bangladesh and Burma, as well as the possible long-term assistance that may be required. Congress may also address whether allegations of human rights abuses by the Burmese security forces, ARSA, or others in Rakhine State can be properly investigated and, if found credible, adjudicated in an appropriate manner. In addition, this crisis provides an opportunity for the United States to reflect on its policy towards Burma in general. The events in Rakhine State have revealed much about the relationship between the Tatmadaw and Aung San Suu Kyi and her government, as well as relations among Burma's various ethnic groups and the nation's prospects for peace. It has also raised questions about Burma's role in regional geopolitical, strategic, and security relations, including those with China and India. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my oral remarks. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to the subcommittee's questions on either my oral or written testimony.
Dr. Martin, I appreciate it, and thank you for that great testimony. We have been blessed and honored to have the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Ed Royce, here, and he has an opening statement. Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Yoho, for giving me this opportunity, because I did want to register my observations about the circumstances that we're dealing with here, and I want to thank you for this important hearing, Chairman Yoho. There are few issues more pressing that demand our attention as much as this issue does this week and last week and the week before. The plight of the Rohingya, an ethnic group that many have called the most persecuted in the world, is also one that deserved our attention a long time ago. As a matter of fact, if we went back to 1982, if we look at what this population has been through, a citizenship law denied Burmese citizenship to Rohingya, even though most of them had lived in that country for generations. They have been denied freedom of movement, denied access to an education, to health care. Burmese Rohingya have been marginalized by every level of government, and that's top to bottom. And today this persecution of these people have reached new horrific levels. Fleeing government retaliation for attacks carried out by the ARSA, a fringe militant group, at least 420,000 Rohingyas have been driven from their homes. They've been forced to cross the border into Bangladesh. I have heard personally their stories of what they've been through, of the villages that have been burned. Hundreds have been killed officially, but we know the number is many multiples of this. And journalists have been denied access to large areas of Rakhine State. So that is why I suspect this number is far, far higher than what's being reported. Now, what's been reported so far is that 200 villages have been burned. But I hear reports that I haven't seen in the papers yet from others who are connected to the internet who tell me about additional villages being burned. Landmines have been placed inside Burma's borders with Bangladesh, maiming a handful of those seeking safe havens, but we know more will be killed by these landmines because no one's made a record of where they've been placed. It is little wonder that the UN Human Rights Chief called this a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, and that's a strong but very warranted condemnation. In the face of these atrocities, Burma's response has been, frankly, appalling. I have no illusion that with a young, democratically elected government, the challenges facing Aung San Suu Kyi are immense, but at the same time, if she's only a counselor, and if the power and the authority actually rests with the military, she still has the responsibility to speak out strongly on this issue of human rights. She's got to bring together widely diverse ethnic groups and work to improve an economy that suffered for decades under the military junta's mismanagement. But nothing is more important than providing for the safety of the people within our borders. And Aung San Suu Kyi's recent statement questioning why the Rohingya were fleeing and denying that the military had conducted clearance operations is wildly off the mark. The perpetrators of this ethnic cleansing must be condemned in the strongest terms and held accountable. The government of Burma cannot be allowed to blatantly and cruelly mistreat Rohingya Muslims and other minority groups. The United States must prioritize the Rohingya and the protection of human rights in its relations with Burma, and we should use the tool at our disposal to help put a stop to this violence and to get USAID down on the ground and to get the Burmese people, the Rohingya people, returned. Lastly, Bangladesh deserves praise for opening its borders to this influx of refugees. It is my sincere hope that the government honors its promise to build shelter for new arrivals and provide the needed medical care to them. And again, I thank Chairman Yoho. I thank the ambassador of Bangladesh who's with us today. We appreciate what you have done, and I think this is a very important hearing. I thank the other members who are engaged in this issue for being involved. Thanks. Yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. I appreciate your input and being here. Mr. Lohman, if you'd continue the testimonies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sherman, other members of the committee, I appreciate you having me here to
Do you have your microphone on?
It is on.
Okay. Maybe move it a little closer.
Okay. Events in Burma over the last month have been heartrending, but they're only a manifestation of deeper realities about Burma that must be taken into better account in U.S. policy going forward, particularly as regards any normalization of U.S.-Burma military ties. The first reality concerns Burma's relationship with China and the relationship between their militaries in particular. To the extent that proposals to open U.S. relations with the Burmese military are about, quote-unquote, balancing China, they vastly overestimate U.S. leverage. The one inescapable geographical reality is that China shares a border with Burma. The Chinese have major interests at stake there, much bigger than our own. Stability along their border, access to the Indian Ocean, routes alternative to the Malacca Straits and the South China Sea for their trade and access to energy resources. To secure these interests, the Chinese play both sides of the fence. They supply and support insurgencies along the border, and at the same time, they maintain a close relationship with the Burmese military and the civilian government. To maintain this position, the Chinese will compete with all the carrots and sticks they have, and they have far more than we do at this point in time on this particular place on the map. Our own efforts to engage in military, by comparison, only compromise our values with little upside. The second reality I think Congress needs to take into account is the potential for the Americans to impact the reform process in Burma, and particularly impact the way the military sees reform. As is well known, civilian authorities in Burma have no control over the military. Some have therefore, here, theorized that the U.S. should give the military a stake in political reform by offering it benefits, chiefly contact with the U.S. military. This ignores equities that the military has in not fully cooperating with future reforms. The Burmese military had its own objective for initiating reforms under the previous regime. Objectives did not encompass fundamental reform of its own sources of power or its ultimate interest in crushing the opposition. The third reality concerns the nature of the Burmese military itself. The political environment in Burma has certainly changed. I think we have to acknowledge that. But I see no reason to believe the military has changed its own character. The textbook example of ethnic cleansing, quote unquote, in Rakhine State is in fact the culmination of a decades-long history of persecution by successive military governments in Burma. And as Mike Martin pointed out, it's only different in degree from what's been happening in other ethnic areas for a very long time, and as Mr. Rohrbacher pointed out as well. Given these realities, I think it's time for Congress to step away for a moment and take a look at our broader approach to Burma, do a reset on our Burma policy. And here are 5 things that you could consider. Number one, remove authorities in the 2015 National Defense Authorization Act granting DoD authority to establish training opportunities for Burmese military personnel. Number two, codify the embargo on the export of defense articles and services to Burma. Number three, reimpose restrictions on Americans doing business with military-linked companies. Number four, continue the prohibition on IMET and foreign military financing. And number five, reimpose asset freezes and visa bans on Burmese military and give these measures basis in new laws tied to new goals that are reflective of the time. It's Congress that dictated Burma policy for 20 years before President Obama moved to end sanctions. Congress should reassert its role and enact legislation that updates America's goals to reflect all that has changed in Burma and all that hasn't. At Heritage, we're engaged in a project to develop a proposal to do just this, and we look forward to reporting back to you the full scope of our findings. Thank you.
Mr. Lohman, I appreciate it. Mr. Sullivan, if you'd go ahead, thank you.
First, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Chairman Royce, Chairman Yoho, and Ranking Member Sherman, and the members of this subcommittee for holding this very timely and very important hearing. Mr. Chairman, there's a tragedy of historic proportions that is unfolding right now in Myanmar, also known as Burma. Nearly 500,000 of one single ethnic group, the Rohingya, have now fled from the country. That's at least 1/3 of the entire population that was living there up to a month ago. There are now more people, more Rohingya living in Bangladesh than there are in Burma, in Myanmar. And hundreds, if not thousands of Rohingya have been killed. There is no question that crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing are taking place. I know this is happening because I was there in Bangladesh, hearing firsthand from people who had experienced these abuses. Refugees International's president, Eric Schwartz, who's a former White House official and Assistant Secretary of State, he has spent 3 decades career in dozens of humanitarian and human rights missions, told me that this is one of the worst he's ever seen. And I'd like just to share one story that I think is illustrative. There's a woman named Leela, a 28-year-old mother of 3 daughters, all under the age of 7. She told me how just a few days before she had been in her village in Rakhine State when soldiers, Myanmar soldiers, came and surrounded her village, lit their homes on fire, shot at them. They fled. One of the soldiers grabbed her by the arm and tried to drag her away. She somehow escaped. Her husband told them to go ahead without him. He was going to try to get the family cows and bring them over. She, with her 3 young daughters, went by foot over to the border to Bangladesh, hiding in waist-deep water for long periods of time, and arrived with just the clothes on her back. Just a few days later, she heard from neighbors who arrived that they had found her husband's body in the river with a gunshot wound to the back of the head. This is just one of so many stories that I and so many others have heard from people fleeing. It is important to recognize ARSA, and it is important to recognize that there are other minorities, Rakhine Buddhists and Hindus, who have been killed and displaced, but it's nowhere near on the scale of the Rohingya. The response of the Myanmar military has been grossly disproportional. It has also unleashed a humanitarian tragedy and crisis in Bangladesh. The government of Bangladesh, to its great credit, has largely welcomed in the Rohingya. It will be vital for the government to continue to work with international agencies, the UNHCR, the International Organization for Migration, and international NGOs to address the needs. And I would just highlight the need for psychosocial and other services for gender-based violence and the heightened risk of human trafficking. The announcement of $32 million in U.S. aid was a very welcome shot in the arm, but UN agencies are now reporting there will be at least $200 million needed over the next 6 months to address the crisis. In the interest of time, I'm happy to speak further on the humanitarian situation with the question period. But ultimately, the only true long-term solution is to address the root causes. And I'd just like to highlight 3 levels of responsibility. First and foremost, as we've heard, a name I think we should be hearing more and more is Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and the military. It's the Myanmar soldiers who are at the front lines of committing these abuses, and they're also with those with the most power to bring them to an end. Secondly, there's the civilian leadership and Aung San Suu Kyi. She's not simply been silent. She has refused to allow a UN fact-finding mission to come in. Her office has accused international NGOs of supporting terrorism. And in her first address on the crisis to the world last week, she expressed ignorance as to why people were fleeing in such numbers, and indicated that the fact that less than 50% of the villages being burned was, by her count, was somehow okay. Yes, she's limited in her influence by the military, but she still has a strong voice, and so far she has only used it largely just to defend actions that are patently indefensible. The third level of responsibility is with world leaders, and in the context of this hearing, with the US government. I thank members of Congress and members of this subcommittee for speaking out on the Rohingya, but so much more is needed. There are several steps that US Congress can take, and I just quickly highlight a few. Prohibiting military-to-military cooperation with Myanmar, placing targeted sanctions on Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and other senior leaders, as well as military-owned enterprises, urging the Trump administration to list those individuals on the specially designated nationals list, also pressing the Trump administration to work through the UN Security Council for multilateral measures, including an arms embargo, targeted sanctions, and authorization of collecting of evidence and possible referral to the ICC if accountability is not had. I'd also emphasize support for robust humanitarian efforts in Bangladesh and the need to push for humanitarian access within Myanmar. Ultimately, for long-term solutions, the Kofi Annan Commission Advisory Commission recommendations should be implemented. And allow me to end on just a personal reflection that when I first started hearing the accounts of what was happening, getting videos from credible sources, and seeing the masses moving to the border, I knew this was something different, and it had shades of Darfur, Srebrenica, and Rwanda. And I hope that we're not looking back in the same way and asking what more could we have done to prevent the Rohingya going down that same road. Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your testimony. I read it, and I could tell it was laced with a lot of emotion, and I can tell that by your testimony, and I appreciate you being there and reporting to us. Ms. Gittleman, if you would be so kind.
Thank you, Chairman Yoho and Ranking Member Sherman, for convening this hearing on such an urgent matter. I speak on behalf of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. We draw upon lessons learned from the Holocaust and the failure to prevent genocide then in order to inform policy decisions today. It is with great alarm that we are here to discuss yet another situation of mass atrocity that the world is failing to prevent and local authorities are refraining from halting. The Simon Skjodt Center sounded the alarm about early warning signs of genocide against the Rohingya 2 years ago. Even then, the warning signs were clear, including the denial of citizenship, segregation between Rohingya Muslims and Buddhist Rakhine, and impunity for violence against Rohingya. In fact, Burma had been listed as one of the top 3 countries most likely to experience a state-led mass killing in the museum's early warning project, and that's in every year since the project began. These warning signs were known, yet not heeded by leaders within Burma and others around the world. During a recent period of renewed international engagement, the Burmese government perpetuated an enabling environment for mass atrocities. Over the past year, the Simon Skjodt Center worked with the human rights organization Fortify Rights to gather testimony from Rohingya who have fled northern Rakhine State. As discussed, deadly attacks by a group known as ARSA were followed by the Burmese military's so-called clearance operations, operations that the government stated were to address the threat of militants, but in practice were brutal and disproportionate attacks against Rohingya civilians. Those who survived shared stories that consistently describe the brutality of the Burmese military and their associates, how they attack entire villages and kill men, women, and children, and employ barbaric tactics such as rape and torture under the guise of countering militants. I spoke to Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh earlier this year after the first round of these so-called clearance operations, and people shared with me horrific stories of witnessing soldiers murder their family members, of fleeing for their lives not knowing of the fate of their loved ones. Women shared disturbing details of sexual violence that appears to have been systematically perpetrated. While the threat posed by ARSA and any militant group should be taken seriously, the greatest risk to civilians in Rakhine State today is coming from the Burmese military. We are witnessing the commission of crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing on a horrific scale. Without an immediate end to atrocity crimes and the creation of safe conditions so that those displaced can safely and voluntarily return in the future, we will witness a brutally effective campaign to rid all Rohingya from Burma. There is mounting evidence that genocide is happening in Burma. There needs to be additional investigation on the intent of perpetrators in order to make a definitive legal declaration of genocide. The Burmese government is currently blocking efforts to investigate those crimes, but the U.S. has the ability to support such an investigation in order to bring the full truth to light. While investigations should, of course, move forward, by the time an investigation can be made into genocidal intent, it may be too late. We should not wait for a formal legal finding of genocide before taking action. The military is the primary perpetrator of mass atrocities and should be pressed with all of our available resources to cease its illegal campaign against Rohingya civilians. While the most urgent demand is for mass atrocities to cease, we must also address the underlying policies and institutions that allowed such crimes to occur. The ultimate responsibility for de-escalating the current cycle of violence and protecting the lives and freedom of Burma's minority populations rests with the country's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi. As a basic principle, we should not fear pressing democratically elected leaders to squarely confront mass atrocities within their country. We can understand the nature of Burma's democratic transition and the outsized role the military continues to play, while at the same time expecting moral responses from its civilian-led government. The U.S. Congress does not need to choose between stopping mass atrocities and supporting a democratic government. After all, a democracy in which mass atrocities are occurring is still wholly unacceptable. Thank you.
Those are great words. I appreciate that. You know, so many times we promote democracy, and a democracy, if you go back to Ben Franklin, was two wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for lunch. The sheep always loses. The beauty of our nation is a republic, a constitutional republic that protects the rights of the minority. And when you have a, you know, I think you said a lot by saying, you know, in the face of fledgling democracy, do we throw everything at that and forsake what's going on the ground to the people there that are getting abused? I appreciate that. Mr. Lohman, you talked about your 5 recommendations, and I agree with you, and they're good, but I see those as more long-term to prevent in the future. What do you do for the now? Because they need help now, and are they effective enough? If we were to do all 5 of your recommendations, do you think that would bring the atrocities to an end?
No, I don't. I mean, in fact, I agree with you. These are more long-term, broader recommendations getting at the bigger problem, which is the role of the military in Burma and its participation in this sort of thing throughout the country, not just with regard to with the Rohingya. I mean, in my estimation, the most immediate need would be to bring relief to those people now, and to end the atrocities and bring relief to them. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have many tools at our disposal, but effective tools to actually bring it to an end immediately. I don't think anyone in the U.S. is prepared to bring military force to bear that would do that, and certainly cutting off generals and putting them on the SDN list and that sort of thing, especially since that's going to take a lot of time, is not going to do it either. You know, I think the only thing we have right now is moral suasion. We have appeal to the UN Security Council. We have some of those things to do, but I don't want to overestimate how much effect that can that can have on the current situation.
All right, I have a follow-up question. This is going to be to Dr. Martin. The previous U.S. administration dramatically removed U.S. sanctions on Burma following the electoral victory of Aung San Suu Kyi, the National League for Democracy. Was lifting the sanctions a mistake? Should sanctions have been eased in a more gradual, stepwise manner, assuming or thinking that in the future sanctions will be put back on?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. As you know, as an analyst for CRS in the capacity I'm here, I'm not supposed to make comment recommendations.
We won't tell anybody.
Okay, but I will draw from your previous question in terms of immediate things that can be done. For example, currently the President has the authority to say, for national interest reasons, that members of the military can enter the United States, and under JADE Act 5B, they're not supposed to be given those visas to enter the United States. The administration, both the previous one and the current one, do hand those out with some regularity. So the administration could, at this point, stop handing out those visa waivers, is an immediate action they could take. Section 5B of the JADE Act is still in effect in terms of the law. It's just been waived because of a presidential executive order that said we no longer are going to impose the economic sanctions on 4 designated categories of people, which includes the military leadership. It is within the authority of the President or whomever he designates to reverse or undo that executive order. So if you're looking for something that could be done from the administration side, revoking that executive order, undoing it, would reimpose the SDN list, or excuse me, wouldn't reimpose the SDN list, but would make the JADE Act 5B back into effect. So one of the things that's a little bit complicated in this situation is that many of the laws imposing sanctions are still on the books, they're still there. They are not being enforced right now because of the previous president's waiving of those sanctions.
That's good information, and we'll look into doing that immediately and give those recommendations. Mr. Sullivan, Aung San Suu Kyi has repeatedly stated that the international coverage of the situation in Rakhine State is biased and inaccurate and incomplete. Is there any merit to her claims? If so, in what respect? And what impact might this have on U.S. relationships with her government? I mean, you've been there.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think if you're there and you speak to the people and about what has happened, it's very clear, as I laid out in my testimony, and this is backed up by satellite images, by videos that have come out. It's very clear that something is happening. So it's honestly mind-boggling that she would say that she doesn't have any idea why people are leaving in such numbers. So it can and should have an effect on the bilateral relationship.
Okay, I appreciate your comments. I'm out of time. I'm going to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Martin, how much aid do we give to Burma, particularly USAID? Do we know?
I don't know the precise figure off the top of my head. I can certainly...
Can you give me a range?
Roughly about $80 million a year right now, fiscal year.
Now, so the first thing we could do is cut that. Is much of that for democracy and human rights promotion, or is it mostly economic development?
There's a combination of economic development promotion, but also we have been a significant supporter of the peace process that's underway under the terms of what is called the National Ceasefire Agreement. Bear in mind, only 8 of the roughly 22, 23 EAOs have signed that ceasefire agreement. And I will throw in that while I was
there is the slogan, no justice, no peace. The idea that we'd be giving money to the Burmese government to help it achieve its objectives. Now, human rights and democracy may not be its objectives, but anything that is consistent with it, that we'd be giving them money for that, seems absurd, especially when we're talking about doing things that would cost the U.S. taxpayer money, such as sanctions or humanitarian aid, all of which may be warranted, but we should first do the thing that reduces expenditures. I'm going to ask this question probably for the record unless somebody knows, but I hope Dr. Martin and his team at CRS will get me an answer. what's being done to publicize to the Muslim world China's support for this murderous regime, and what's being done to publicize the fact that we are doing more to protect the Rohingya than any other state other than those in the immediate neighborhood. I don't see anyone anxious to answer that question right now, so I'll ask that for the record. Now, an uncomfortable question. Is ARSA engaging in some smaller atrocities? And given our support for the Rohingya, can we persuade them to limit their actions to those against the Burmese military? Mr. Lohman or anyone else?
There are reports of ARSA carrying out attacks and
against civilians.
Yes,
Okay.
and of course.
And for the record, they are tiny in quantity compared to what the Rohingya people are facing. At the same time, they undermine ARSA's the moral case that we are trying to make, and they also undermine the ability of the Burmese government to change its policy and become more reasonable. One atrocity against Buddhists in Rakhine State could make it difficult for those inside the Burmese government to change its policy. Let's see. Is Voice of America carrying the message that it should? Do the average person in Burma know what the world thinks of what their government is doing? Mr. Lohman, anybody know? If we don't have an answer, I'll ask for the record.
I can get you more information, sir. I know Radio Free Asia, for example, has regular stories about what's going on in Rakhine State.
Mm-hmm.
And are those
in the Burmese language?
Yes, there is a Voice of America or Radio Free Asia Burmese broadcast.
One would hope that they would have the courage at the Burmese service to push these stories, not just in the, I assume we have that we also broadcast in the language of Bangladesh. And it's a lot easier for that service to cover this message. And I'll just throw this out here. If the Burmese government disenfranchises some of its people, I mean, a government has a certain amount of territory for the benefit of its people. They have disclaimed over 1 million of their people. If they permanently show that they're unwilling or unable to protect the Rohingya, is a long-term solution the transfer of territory to Bangladesh. We obviously, as a nation, don't like to see sovereign borders changed, but when a nation refuses to allow its own people to live on its territory, it loses the right to control that territory. Dr. Martin.
Real quick, it's interesting you bring that up because in the early days when there was a previous insurgent group among the Rohingya, what they wanted at that time was to be part of what was Pakistan, East Pakistan.
Which is today Bangladesh.
Which is today Bangladesh. So I do not know if ARSA and its leadership or the Rohingya people in general would want
obviously, the first choice is the return of the refugees in citizenship, protection, and living in harmony with the other people of Rakhine State. But if that cannot be achieved, then a transfer of population has been achieved through this ethnic cleansing. Perhaps a transfer of territory would go along with it. For the record, I want to point out that the ambassador from Bangladesh has no comment.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. We'll now go to Ms. Ann Wagner.
Chairman, very, very much. I appreciate it, as I said in my opening statement, your willingness to hold this hearing. In 2013, there was an article in the Emory International Law Review calling for an international investigation into mass atrocity crimes against Rohingya Muslims. I know this because one of my staff members, Rachel Wagley, actually published the article. Sadly, everything written then is just as pertinent today. And this was back in 2013. It's heartbreaking how little the conflict has changed. And Ms. Gittleman, you wrote that even if an investigation is conducted, we cannot wait for a formal finding of genocide to take action. I agree. What are the obstacles to establishing an international investigation? Where is the United Nations? And how do you believe the U.S. should leverage its influence in this, to disperse some sort of international investigation?
Well, thank you for the question, Representative Wagner. I think this is a really important issue. The reason why we might not have sufficient information in order to make a legal declaration about the situation is because it's so difficult to access the areas of northern Rakhine State where the military has been committing these crimes. There has been a fact-finding mission that was created by the United Nations Human Rights Council. So far, the Burmese government has resisted any efforts to cooperate with that mission to allow them to undertake their investigation in a way that would get them the access that they require. I think the situation now, in the face of denials and obstacles placed by the Burmese government, there requires a greater push internationally for an independent investigation. And I think the United States is well placed as one of the key players, both on the Security Council and as one of the forces that I think would help mobilize more support for an international investigation. This would be an extremely important next step.
It's been going on, well, for 60 years, but for 5 years now with Rohingya Muslims. Well past time. Ms. Gittleman or Mr. Sullivan, we hear so many stories of rape and sexual abuse coming out of Burma, and you outlined some of that, Ms. Gittleman. The Bangladesh embassy has reported that many of the Rohingya flowing into Bangladesh are women and children. Can you talk about the risks facing women and girls in Rakhine State and help us understand how the international humanitarian response can better confront sexual violence?
Sure. I'll address quickly and then turn to my colleague. What we've seen from people who have fled such horrific violence and who have come into Bangladesh, many have shared stories of use of rape and other forms of sexual violence. And the way that they describe these crimes being committed makes it appear that they are being done systematically, that it is being used as a weapon specifically against women and girls, against Rohingya women and girls. That this is not ad hoc, this isn't something extraneous, it certainly isn't part of any kind of counterinsurgency operation. Mm-hmm. And this is something that has been, we've heard stories from people from across different geographic areas, which leads us to believe this might be something that is quite widespread. So if you imagine women and girls fleeing from their homes, seeing horrific violence, being subjected to sexual violence, running, getting over the border, which may take days or weeks, once they arrive with very little possessions, little money, then they need to set about accessing the kind of health care and services that they would require. And you can only imagine how daunting that must be for people who have experienced so much trauma. So there needs to be assistance to make sure that those many people can get the aid that they need.
You know, and let me just jump in here because I have limited time, and I have another question that I want to make. Thank you very much. It's just horrific. I am so disappointed and angered, frankly, by Suu Kyi's actions, or lack of actions. To whoever can best answer, has she made some sort of agreement with the Burmese military to enable violence against Rohingya? Does she have any political room whatsoever to provide any moral leadership at this point with respect to the Rohingya? Surely other minorities in the country can sympathize with the plight of the Rohingya. Please.
Yeah, I can't speculate as to what her motivations are, and I share the disappointment. But the fact is she does have a powerful voice, and she was voted in overwhelmingly, has lots of support that she can garner. And just quickly on your previous question, I would just point to, as I mentioned in my testimony, was in Bangladesh a few months ago, and Refugees International released a report at that time in July, based on on what had happened since the influx of 87,000 Rohingya after October 2016, and talk about the gender-based violence and the accounts that we heard. And so you can only imagine that today, with over 400,000,
Right.
approaching 500,000 now, what level of a challenge that is. And there were doctors from the UN just yesterday or the day before who came out and talked about documenting dozens of cases.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. We'll now go to Dr. Bear from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the ranking member, and also thank you to the witnesses. It's tragic. I mean, as Mr. Sullivan pointed out, we're seeing genocide and ethnic cleansing repeating itself. And if we just think about our moral character and our values as a nation, we can't sit idly by. And you've outlined, a few ways that we can approach this in terms of trying to leverage the Burmese government and the Burmese military. From the public perspective, in my own community back in Sacramento, different groups are starting to come back, religious groups, public advocates, et cetera, and they're trying to raise awareness. So again, a lot of people aren't paying attention to the plight of the Rohingya, but they're trying to raise local awareness. Mr. Sullivan, maybe from your perspective, what can the public do right now? Because we also want to see that public pressure.
Yes, thank you. I think, going back to what you do in democracy, you contact your representatives, and hopefully there are more like those on this subcommittee that are hearing about this and speaking out and realizing how urgent of a situation this is. As I mentioned, it's patently different from pretty much anything I've ever seen, and it's just really urgent. I think there's a lot of advocacy groups out there that try to get this information out and get people motivated.
So just trying to raise the volume on it, so more and more people are aware of what's
going on. Reach out to local newspapers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe sticking with you, Mr. Sullivan, and I'm a physician by training with a background in public health. Thinking about the number of refugees who have flown to Bangladesh, you mentioned that you were recently in the camps there. Can you talk about the conditions in the camp?
Sure. As I said, it was just starkly different from just a few months ago, where areas that had been all green are just overrun, and people carrying bamboo sticks and tarps and rope to try to prop up shelters. And the monsoon rains are going on, so people walking through ankle-deep mud. And it's just an immense challenge just to record who's coming in. The Bangladesh government, working with UNHCR and others, has begun to take biometric information and give out cards to try to keep track of who's there. But they've maybe done around 13,000 of the nearing 500,000 who are there now.
Okay, and the majority are in camps. They're not, in what we've seen in Jordan with Syrian refugees is they've tried to assimilate them and get them into urban communities. But I have to imagine the majority in Bangladesh are living in camp-like settings. That raises public health concerns and real public health concerns, because not just the tragedy of being forced from their home. Now we have to very much think about the possibilities of disease and so forth, and the toll that would take on morbidity. Are they seeing those public health issues right now?
Yeah, it's a huge risk. I mean, there was already, there were outbreaks after the October influx, and this is just on a much larger scale. So, yeah, it's a very high risk.
Bangladesh is not a wealthy country. What can and what should we be doing at the congressional level and at the international level to help support the refugees?
Well, I think it's, as I mentioned, there was $32 million that the U.S. government gave, but the needs are a lot more. So getting that financial support out there and making sure that there's proper coordination and going along with guidelines, internationally accepted guidelines, and building shelters and providing medical care.
My colleague, Mr. Sherman's identified $80 million that potentially we could move over. So, it's tragic. I know, we can't speculate on Aung San Suu Kyi's motives here, but for someone who has previously been held in pretty high regard by many of us, the the lack of not using that bully pulpit to speak out and push back. I mean, this is a person who previously has shown moral courage. You know, if they're paying attention and listening, if she's watching this, there was never a time for moral courage like the time right now. So, you know, this is the time to use that bully pulpit. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Barra. Now we'll go to Mr. Rohrbacher from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just a suggestion, and first of all, I appreciate you holding this conference. I've learned a lot. That's the purpose of the conferences. We would have learned more, I believe, had we had someone from the Burmese government here to give their side of the story. I'm the chairman I've been chairman of various subcommittees. No matter how reprehensible the other side is on whatever issue, I've always made sure that both sides had a chance, and I think it would have been interesting to hear an interaction and charges and refutations and how someone would have responded to the charges we've heard today. I have learned a lot, as I say. Let me ask some more fundamental questions here. What in the Rakhine state, how many of those people are Rohingya? I'm sorry, I mispronounced it. What percentage are that, and what percentage are other ethnic groups?
Congressman Rohrbacher, let me try to give you a rough idea. First off, the easiest answer is no one actually knows. A couple years ago, Burma tried to conduct a nationwide census of its population, the first one in decades. But when it came to Rakhine State, when they wanted to do a census of the Rohingya households, the provision was they had to self-identify as Bengalis. That was objectionable to all those households.
What's your guess as to?
Well, the figure that's normally put around is 1 million to 1.1 million Rohingya.
Okay.
And then I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head of the Rakhine. The Rakhine, who tend to live in the southern part of the state, are the majority of the population. But scattered throughout the state are other ethnic groups. Interestingly enough, there's another group called the Khmer, who are also Sunni Muslims.
Okay.
They're citizens, but they're a very small percentage.
So what's the overall? What's the guess of the population?
I believe the figure's around 5 million.
5 million?
Yeah.
What?
But I'd have to double check that on you.
Okay, we don't know. Okay, anybody else have a guess? Okay, so we have I don't want to even guess, but there's 1 million people that are part of this ethnic group that now has been targeted. We know that. And it says here that, and they were denied citizenship. This ethnic group that we're talking about today has been present in this state since Burma became a country. Is that 1948? This is not a new group that showed up, so to claim that they're illegal immigrants, which Burma does, is inaccurate in that they've been there the whole time. Let me just note, in Burma, having a little background in Burma, I know about the Chin, the Kachin, the Karens, the Karennis, and now we know this ethnic group, as well as there's in this same area, there are several ethnic groups. So the idea that if there's ever going to be any peace in that country, basically the Burmese, who control the capital and control the country as a whole, had better be accepting of that, or there's just going to be one big bloodbath that, as we have seen, by the way, there were, again, hundreds of thousands of Karens and Karenni who were Christians who had to leave Burma in order to flee for Thailand 20, 30 years ago. I know I visited them, and I visited Aung San Suu Kyi when she was under house arrest. And let me just say, I too am disappointed that she has not spoken up. Only a respect for human rights by that country as a whole, with all of these people, is going to bring about, any type of peace or end to this. Let me just note that and thank you very much for the good job you did with the congressional research on giving us a background. I noticed that the militant group that is supportive of, and again, is it the Rohingyas? The Rohingyas actually in August 2017 conducted a coordinated attack on 30 police and army outposts. So this isn't a bunch of pacifists who are now being slaughtered by the Burmese military. And on October 2016, there was again attacks by this particular, the army representing this ethnic group. I think if we're going to be peacemakers in the world, which I think the United States should be, and I agree with you that we need to participate, go down there and participate in an international investigation, but we need to be really honest about what we see and not, again, just taking sides because you'll get a headline for today where it seems that this is what the reality is, even though we haven't investigated it. So this reminds me a lot, Mr. Chairman, of the, and pardon me for talking too long here, reminds me of another crisis we went through early on between the Serbs and the Kosovars. And reminds me a lot of that. And the Serbs were involved with all kinds of violent activity, and the Burmese remind me a lot of the Serbs at their worst. But let me just say that we should be a force for good in this world and to find out truth. And with truth, we do need both sides to be telling us their story. And I would hope that someday that we can play a positive role with the Burmese. And with that said, thank you very much for your testimony. I've learned a lot, and I will be looking forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, to make sure that we play a positive role. One last question. How much have our Muslim friends in other countries, especially oil-rich countries, contributed to the plight of these poor people who are now being pushed into Bangladesh and are under such horrible circumstances? Has there been any major help being offered by their fellow Muslims? Do we know?
Yes, the Saudi Arabia in particular has been outspoken, as has Malaysia recently, in terms of seeking support for this community. And I can't think of the name right now, but one of the multilateral Islamic groups has tried to go into Rakhine State to provide assistance in the past, but has been rebuffed by the government.
Rebuffed by the Bangladesh government?
No, this is inside Burma,
inside
Myanmar.
Burma, okay. Well, I'm not looking for people who are outspoken. I'm looking for someone who's outspent. So I hope so we can get some assistance down, because what was described today, these people are in a desperate situation. Good people around the world should try to save them in this desperate situation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you both for your comments. We'll next go to Mr. Conley from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. Mr. Sullivan, well, any of you, I mean, is this from a legal, international legal point of view, ethnic cleansing?
So ethnic cleansing doesn't have a clear legal definition, but by any kind of standards of what it's been described as, displacing an entire group of people forcibly, then yes, it absolutely. And as the High Commissioner for Human Rights has said, it's a textbook case of ethnic cleansing.
Right. So you're right. It's not exactly a legal concept, I suppose, in The Hague, but when the Commissioner for Human Rights uses it, it has some force of meaning. Do we believe that it's the intention of the Burmese government or Burmese military or both, in fact, to cleanse Burma of the Rohingya period? Any of you can feel free.
So there are many legal terms that can be used to describe this situation. Crimes against humanity appears.
No, Ms. Gittleman, my question is, do we believe that it is the intention of the military or the government of Burma to, in fact, eliminate the Rohingya from Burma or Myanmar?
What we're seeing today is a campaign of ethnic cleansing. What we
Ms.
don't
Gittleman,
know
I
is
know
the
that.
exact
We've established
intent.
that. I'm asking a different question. Is it the intention, do we believe, of the current government or military of Myanmar to essentially be Rohingya-free? Is that what they're doing?
What we don't know is the exact intent of those perpetrators.
Mr. Lohman, do you have any views on that matter?
No, I mean, I agree. We don't.
Please
know
speak
their-
into
we-
the microphone, Mr.
We don't know their intent. I mean, how can we know their intent?
Could you make a wild guess, given the
Well,
fact that 3/4 people are in
Yeah, well,
Bangladesh?
yes, absolutely. I would say by the looks of it, yes, it is ethnic cleansing.
Dr. Martin? No, I'm not asking that question.
Okay.
Are they trying to make sure that Burma or Myanmar is in fact free of all Rohingya? Is that their goal? So that that ethnic minority no longer is present in their country? That's my question. Is there a strategic goal here besides we just don't like them and we're responding over, as you in your testimony said, clearly overreacting to insurgent attacks on the Burmese military?
I will speak to the record of what we know from what's been said. Aung San Suu Kyi, in her speech of September 19th to the international community, said that she would welcome the return of the Rohingya. However, it's under a 1993 agreement with Bangladesh, and there's provisions about documentation or verification of the fact that they were residents, not necessarily citizens, of Burma before. So I believe there's some indication, at least on her statements, of a willingness to see a return of some portion, exactly what portion, of the roughly 500,000 who have left.
But she
now, in terms of the military, I did speak to a lieutenant general when I was in Naypyidaw just 2 weeks ago. They do not portray this as any effort on their part to try to make the people move out of the area. All that they're doing is pursuing ARSA's members and their sympathizers. However, I cannot find the quote right now, but there was a quote from a few years ago when there was a similar incidence of Rohingya leaving, where somebody senior in the military said, if some friendly nation will take all 1 million of them, we'd be happy to see them all leave. And that is on the historical record. So I would suspect one could infer that at least in the Top Madaw, there are some who would welcome it.
Thank you, because I think we have to be clear about that. I mean, frankly, futzing around about, well, whether we're not sure of their intent and who can read their minds, their behavior is what tells us what's happening. And this isn't some localized action. This is mass relocation of people to another country. And thank God Bangladesh is there and willing to accept them. I mean, the international community owes Bangladesh, a very poor country, a great debt of gratitude for receiving the Rohingya. It seems to me they're a poor country. They already had large numbers of the Rohingya already there, and now they're almost doubling, more than doubling that population. Have people besides Aung San Suu Kyi, have people in the legislative body in Myanmar spoken out against what's happening? Anyone know?
I haven't seen any speaking out within the parliament. It's very, the popular opinion is very much against the Rohingya, and it's a very dangerous kind of thing to speak out, which is why the international pressure is so much more important.
And Dr. Martin, I think you cited Aung San Suu Kyi, but she's severely circumscribed by the military. I mean, she doesn't control the military directly. So if the military wants to continue doing this, it's not entirely within her ability to influence that situation. I was in Myanmar last year, and I was very struck by the competing centers of power in Naypyidaw, and the great caution with which each side sort of wanders past the other. Mr. Lohman, you look like you wanted to comment on that. I'd welcome the comment.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I agree with that sentiment, and I
please speak into the microphone.
I may be in a minority here, but I think we have to be careful not to be too hard on Aung San Suu Kyi, as I do think she is very tightly restrained.
Right.
And I find it hard to believe that in the last 20 years she's completely changed her character to the point where she'd support this kind of thing. If anything, I think her remarks our demonstration of how tightly constrained she is. She
Yeah.
could come out tomorrow and be very vocal about it, but how's that going to change the situation? That doesn't pull on the heartstrings of the military. They could care less what she thinks or anybody else in civilian government thinks. They could end this whole experiment in democracy tomorrow if they want. And I think she well understands that. So I don't want to give her a completely benefit of the doubt. I know she said some things that are a little bit puzzling and disturbing, sort of in a positive sense. You know, said things about the Rohingya that make you wonder, but I think we do have to give her a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. We haven't supported her for 25 years for nothing.
If I'm going to end, Mr. Chairman, but I just think that's a very critical point, and I thank Mr. Lohman for making that point. I was struck by the same thing. The latitude she has, especially when the military is involved, is very limited. And it is a very delicate dance with two powers coexisting very uneasily in Myanmar. None of that's to say one should not speak out about a blatant human rights violation such as we're witnessing now. But as to her intent and how she's reacting, there are some severe limitations on her that could have severe consequences if she stepped over unwritten boundaries. So we do need to understand that as we approach this massive human rights problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman,
your
for having
input.
the hearing.
We'll next go to Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen on the panel, how many Rohingya are left? What's the estimate? Is there 1 million to start, or where do we know?
Like I said earlier, there's no accurate figures on exactly how many were there beforehand. But if we say roughly 500,000 have fled at this point since
August 25th, according to this?
August 25th, that would reduce that population to half. You had 87,000 before earlier in the year. So roughly somewhere between maybe a quarter to a half.
Quarter to 500,000 left, right? And
of the percentage, 200,000 to 500,000.
200 to 500,000, and if according to this, this is what I referenced. I read it last night, Wall Street Journal article from a week ago or so. Since August 25th, an estimated 430,000 have fled Rakhine State. So if the numbers are accurate here, in about a month, I mean, we're all talking here, right? And these people are being, heck, if they're lucky, they're being kicked out. If they're unlucky, they're not going to make it anywhere. They're dying in place. That's what it seems to me. It seems like there's about a month to go. So my question is, what can be done right now? How's an investigation going to happen in a sovereign nation that refuses to let anybody come in to investigate?
Well, I think you raise an important question about all the Rohingya who remain in northern Rakhine State. We know the numbers of people who have crossed to Bangladesh, but there remains a significant fraction who are still in northern Rakhine State. Whether they're displaced from their homes, we don't know because we can't access the area. But those people, of course, remain at extremely high risk of atrocities if they haven't been targeted yet.
Yeah, imagine.
So they would require protection, they require aid, just as people who have crossed the border have.
So no sooner is Burma or Myanmar or whatever you want to call it going to allow, as a sovereign nation, going to allow the United States or Bangladesh or China or anybody else come in and tell them how to run their railroad. The answer seems to be somewhere in the UN, right? The clock's ticking. So since we're probably not going to be able to force anything as a sovereign nation any more than we would want Burma to force anything in the United States, what is the United Nations doing, and what are we doing in concert with the United Nations right now to take action right now, today, within a few days, because in 30 days, we probably won't talk about this anymore because it'll be history, right, and we'll be writing about it. So what's happening now?
Yeah, tomorrow the UN Secretary General will be addressing the UN Security Council for the first time in open debate. There's been closed discussion. It was very welcome that the Trump administration, after about 3 weeks, came out with a call for the UN Security Council to take swift action. I would say that, you know, I laid out some of the things I would recommend, including the multilateral sanctions, arms embargo. On the accountability—
Sir, with all due respect,
I don't think the UN needed to wait for President Trump to come out. This is what we have a UN for. And talking about sanctions when this is going to be over in a month, according to these numbers, or substantially, if these hold, all that's a discussion tomorrow is meaningless. What you need is a vote, and it's the UN, Burma has to accept some kind of envoy to go into their country and witness and have an investigation. That's what everybody in the room knows it. Other than that, all we're talking about is platitudes and we wish this could happen. Sanctions aren't going to do anything in that amount of time. By the time sanctions matter, it's all going to be over, and we can't. And they're not even having the discussion yet.
Well, I agree, but I think you can't wait for that. And there are things that are being done, like the UN fact-finding mission is going to Bangladesh where they can access people and collecting evidence.
Are they going to be allowed to be in Rakhine State, this fact-finding mission?
The government has said they will not allow them.
So all that's pointless as well. Look, I appreciate the information. I appreciate your passion, compassion, and your interest in this whole. It's very frustrating, but all we're doing is talking right now, and it doesn't seem like there's a solution in this room that's recognized. The solution is at the UN, and somebody ought to not wait till tomorrow. Somebody ought to be meeting right now and not having a discussion about, is this happening, but have a vote right now, tonight, today, on going in there and doing something, right? That's what needs to happen. Otherwise, this is all just unfortunate conjecture, and these poor people are going to either leave or be killed. That's the answer, unfortunately. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Your comments and your passion, and you know, you bring up a very good point. Mr. Sullivan, reading your, I believe it's your testimony. Yeah, it was yours. Your recommendations, Congress should, and then you listed everything, press the Trump administration to work through the UN Security Council. And one of your bulleted points were support for a referral to the International Criminal Court unless Myanmar authorities take significant measures to address the human rights. And I'm thinking the same thing Mr. Perry did. Why? I mean, we see what's going on. We need to put the pressure on now. And our recommendations that are going to come out of this meeting because of you guys are going to be for JDAC to be revoked immediately. The $63 million that was requested for aid to Burma, our recommendation is we're going to hold that. Our team doesn't know that yet. I guess they do now. And then to go to the UN and say, you need to do something now. We demand you act now. This is something, again, that we're in the 21st century, and I see these atrocities going on that makes you not even want to be part of the human race to see these going on. And everybody out here in here has a representative that you vote for. Demand that they do something about that. Please do something about that. And let's see, what else do I have here? This is a question I want to ask. If you all can comment on this, if you have time for one more question. Burma is a member of the ASEAN nations, one of the members, 10 nations. What is the sentiment of the other nations in ASEAN with this kind of action? Do they have the wherewithal, the fortitude to say, what you're doing is wrong, you need to bring it to an end? What are your thoughts on that? We'll start with Dr. Martin if you have time and patience.
Sure. Real quickly, ASEAN actually just recently released a statement with respect to what's going on in Burma, or Myanmar as they call it. It was expressing concern would be the way I'd phrase it. Malaysia objected to that statement, saying that it did not address sufficiently the situation in Rakhine State, or the situation for the Rohingya. Two other aspects with respect to ASEAN: they have a traditional policy of non-interference in internal affairs, and so this would be considered possibly an internal affair. They don't want to get involved. However, they also have set up an ASEAN Human Rights Commission, which has been criticized for being ineffective and not taking much action. So one could argue this is a time where the ASEAN Human Rights Commission could step up and take an active interest.
Mr. Lohman?
Yeah, if you think the UN is ineffective addressing the situation, ASEAN is completely useless. So, I mean, because of their non-interference principle and other considerations, they've watched this over the last 25 years or so and done really nothing about the whole range of issues in Burma. So I wouldn't expect much, at least in being able to help this current situation. The one area that might be able to be of some assistance is helping to get humanitarian aid into the country. Back in 2008, that they played a role in Cyclone Nargis that was there. And you know, they did play a role. It was very late. The Burmese prevented humanitarian assistance from coming in to address the results of a natural disaster, but eventually they did, and they did through ASEAN, so they may be able to be of some help in that regard.
I would just add that the Prime Minister of Thailand will be meeting with the White House early next week, so that's an opportunity to express their need to put more pressure on Myanmar and to accept Rohingya who are fleeing.
I think we're seeing growing concern from other countries in the region, which, as was said, is a different tack. With ASEAN, of course, they've been premised on cooperation, and I think it's the sheer urgency of this crisis that is making some countries in the region change their tune.
And I just want to say how much I appreciate you all being here, because you're bringing it to light. You know, you're shining a light on just a terrible tragedy and atrocity that's going on around the world. And as you brought up, Mr. Sullivan, how many times are we going to go through this? You know, we've seen this throughout history. We've seen it, you know, Auschwitz in World War II and all the genocide that happened there, Rwanda, Bosnia, Serbia, Darfur. You know, how many more times do we want to tolerate this? There's got to be a better way, and the UN isn't effective, but there needs to be an enforcement mechanism within the UN, a multinational enforcement that can bring this kind of garbage to an end. These kind of crimes against humanity just need to be brought to an end, and the people that are responsible for this, we need to prosecute those people, and it needs to be done rapidly to send a signal out to the rest of the world. And for clarification, it was not a revocation of the JDAC. It was the no waiver on the, I can't read that. What does that say? On the sanctions. So we are going to act on what you guys told us, and I appreciate it. And Ambassador Ziauddin, thank you for being here and what your country is doing. And our office is going to reach out to you to work on this more specifically. With that, the meeting is adjourned. The notes will be added to the congressional record. And we thank you again for your time, your patience, and your tolerance.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Counselor from the